intuitive level or remembered from her grandmother Rose's simple explanations, but it turned out that all of this had almost scientific explanations, at least from the perspective of Eastern healing practices. It filled her with sheer delight. In May, when the girl turned 12, Betsy and Uncle Jonathan set out on the road again. This time, they didn't have a specific destination in mind. One day, Uncle Jonathan simply asked, "Have you ever seen the sea?" "On TV," replied Betsy. "Seeing it on TV is not the same." "I was thinking, wouldn't it be nice for us to go somewhere by the sea? Or, how do you feel about that?" "That sounds great," Betsy replied, more delighted by the fact that this idea had inspired her friend. "I'd love to be there." "Imagine," the man said thoughtfully, "a whole 8 months of summer." "Fantastic." "Renting a place there might be expensive, especially during the resort season, but it's worth it. We can manage it. We crave warmth and sunshine." "We do," agreed Betsy. And a week later, they set off for warmer climes. All the love that Uncle Jonathan had reserved for his long-lost daughter was now poured onto Betsy. The darkness lifted from his face. His gait became sprightly once again, and his figure more robust. He often smiled, talked incessantly about one thing or another, and even learned to crack jokes, something he had never been inclined to do before. It was as if a burden had been lifted from his shoulders, and for the first time in his life, he felt entirely free. The 4,000-kilometer journey became the happiest time for Betsy in the past 2.5 years. The velvet season was picking up in the entire Black Sea region, so they had to put in some effort to find reasonably decent accommodation. They managed to rent a small room, 5 by 3 meters, in a house on a hill, standing at a distance from other buildings. Drafty and with a frail roof, it wasn't popular among vacationers, which is why it was available. Moreover, the rent didn't correspond to the amenities and the character of the landlady. Valeria, a woman in her 60s with a red face and a mass of gray hair, was something not many could tolerate. During the first week, Uncle Jonathan and Betsy only heard reproaches from her. Their appearance was like that of bandits, and the girl was too quiet. Could she be a hostage of that thug with a scar? The new tenants didn't argue with her, calmly accepting the excessive criticism, and Uncle Jonathan even repaired the house's frail roof, fixed the fence that had fallen over, and patched up the boat, which had been slowly decaying by the reed-covered pond near the house. Valeria became more subdued. Her criticism increasingly blended with complaints about her difficult life. It turned out she had an older, sick sister living 5 kilometers away, whom she had to care for, preparing her meals every day, tidying up her apartment, and making sure she didn't do anything foolish. 3 years ago, doctors had given her a grim diagnosis: dementia. To officially qualify her for disability benefits, they required Valeria to place her sister in a psychiatric facility for a period, something Valeria couldn't bring herself to do. Her character was far from pleasant, but she couldn't bear to do that to her sister. Valeria even claimed that compared to her sister, who had lost her sanity, she was an angel. The sister had a difficult personality even before her illness, and she could wear down anyone, even the mentally strong. Losing her memory and the ability to handle basic tasks didn't make her more manageable. However, at least she couldn't trouble people anymore since they understood that she was officially not in her right mind. Uncle Jonathan had to find a source of income again. He bought a bicycle and got a job as a casual laborer at the fish market, which required him to ride 20 kilometers each day and then pedal the same distance back. Additionally, every third night, he guarded a food warehouse, where they allowed him to take something from the supplies once a month as sack of potatoes, for kilograms of sugar or pasta. This provided a decent supplement to their income. Betsy, too, kept herself busy. As Valeria's health deteriorated with each passing year, she increasingly sent Betsy on trips to her ailing sister instead of going herself. Strangely, Iris, as her relative was named, would become docile in Betsy's presence, as if sensing something greater in the girl than in an ordinary person. These trips drained Betsy of a lot of energy. It seemed that, albeit unwillingly, the girl was transferring her strength to the sick woman. And that's precisely what Iris felt, absorbing their energy like an energy vampire. Betsy hadn't learned how to set boundaries in such situations yet, but for her work as a caregiver, Valeria deducted 40% of the rent, which was much more substantial than a sack of potatoes. The disrupted neural connections in Iris's brain began to repair themselves. By the following spring, to the surprise of the doctors, the dementia had receded. On one hand, Valeria was delighted because, despite Iris's challenging personality, she remained the only close person in her life. On the other hand, she was afraid that the recovery would end, that they would, as it had always happened before, have a falling out and cease to communicate with each other, not even greeting or calling each other on holidays for years. However, Valeria's fears proved to be unfounded. Not only did Iris completely and miraculously recover, but she also became an entirely different person, placid, fair, friendly, always ready to lend a helping hand if someone needed it. Her brain seemed to have been reprogrammed with a new pattern. Because of this turn of events, Valeria herself began to change. Harsh words disappeared from her vocabulary. Complaints over the smallest things were replaced with expressions of gratitude and praise, and even the redness left her face. She now always appeared neatly groomed, with an elegantly pale face, clasping her hands over her stomach and being genuinely pleased with everything: the view of the forest at the foot of the hill, bluish in the evening mist, and the bird song in the cherry orchard. In such harmony, 3 whole years passed by. When Betsy turned 16, 2 events occurred simultaneously that made her sit up and feel the impending changes once again. In May, Iris passed away. Then, in July, Uncle Jonathan broke his hip in a bicycle accident. The strenuous physical labor had been wearing down his strength, though he never complained or expressed any grievances. However, Betsy could see that time was taking its toll on this giant of a man as well. Valeria also seemed to have withered away, shrunken in size, becoming uncommunicative, and wandering through the house and garden with dull eyes. Uncle Jonathan, who had become the sole source of income aside from meager pensions, now lay in bed, gazing at the ceiling contemplatively, realizing that the situation for their little group was far from ideal. Betsy hadn't learned how to mend bones in a fractured hip yet. Betsy attempted to find a decently paying job herself, but all she was offered were positions like cleaning, sanitation work, or delivering various odds and ends to the beaches until the tourist season ended. The promised wages wouldn't be enough to resolve their current situation. If Betsy had any documents, perhaps she could have found something better. But she was nobody, a girl of unknown origin, without education, profession, or promising connections. Until autumn, Valeria didn't demand anything from her tenants. The garden still provided some food, and the rent from Iris's vacated apartment brought in a bit of income. But in October, when the guests' savings were exhausted, Valeria hinted for the first time that something needed to be done. Every evening, Betsy began to retreat into the forest to cry in solitude. She couldn't come up with a solution. However, she didn't want to show her tears or despair to Uncle Jonathan. He was gradually nudging the girl toward the idea of going to the local administration and seeking help, describing in detail their entire story of misfortunes. Surely someone would help. Maybe they would even find some documents. It was quite possible that people had been looking for Betsy for a while, realizing she had gone missing from Cleanstream. Uncle Jonathan hoped for that, unaware of what had happened to the truck carrying the archives. And even if they were able to identify her, Maybe they'd place her in some institution for just a couple of years until she turned 18, and then she could find a decent place in the world. He, with God's help, would manage on his own. He would get in touch with his daughter. Maybe she hadn't become completely calloused in her soul and wouldn't refuse basic support. Surely, she had already finished college and was working in her profession. Betsy listened calmly to her adult friend's somber monologues but understood within herself that no daughter would respond to Uncle Jonathan's appeals. Besides, he wouldn't write her letters. He wasn't the type to burden anyone with his problems. It wasn't pride, it was a natural trait of his character, and the institution, absolutely not. Betsy had grown accustomed to her free life, to an environment where she was understood even without words and where she didn't have to expect malice and deceit from neighbors every day. She couldn't envision her existence without Uncle Jonathan and even without Valeria. Betraying her friends and running away, hoping that entirely unfamiliar people would rescue her from trouble. How could such a thing be possible? For what? For whom? One night, around 2 a.m., their landlady gently knocked on their door. Betsy was still awake, reading a book in the dim light. She got up from the couch and cracked the door open. "Betsy," Valeria almost whispered, "can I have a moment of your time? Please get dressed and come to the kitchen. I have something very important to discuss with you." Betsy thought that now the landlady would surely evict them from the house. She was probably calling her in for a final heart-to-heart talk. "Please have a seat," Valeria began. "I've made some tea, and there's cherry jam. I apologize for the late hour, but I've been troubled by this thought." "Thank you," Betsy said, taking a chair and cradling the hot tea in her hands. "You know, you're quite an unusual young lady," Valeria continued. "I've suspected it for a while. Take, for instance, Iris. May she rest in peace. Her descent into madness wasn't just a random occurrence, though the doctors said otherwise, claiming it was not uncommon. Dementia is a mysterious condition, not fully understood by science, but I know it wasn't a coincidence. You are the cause of it. You're the one who created this miracle." Betsy felt a sense of relief. She didn't quite grasp where Valeria was going with this, but at least she wasn't about to kick them out of the house. "Then I talked to Jonathan," Valeria continued, "and what he told me confirmed my suspicions. Just please listen calmly, and don't assume I have any ulterior motives or schemes. I thought that perhaps you could earn a living with your gift. Don't dismiss it right away. I see how frustrated you are because you can't help Jonathan. Clearly, not all ailments are within your reach. I understand that dealing with such matters might not be suitable for trade, but you don't have much of a choice. Sooner or later, you'll have to compromise your principles. You could leave Jonathan here, and that would be bad. You have only one tool, a gift from God that can help you climb out of the situation and pull Jonathan with you. I'll find clients for you, and there won't be any issues with finances. I won't deceive or betray you. You can trust me. We'll start small and see how it goes. What do you say, Betsy?" After weighing the pros and cons for about 5 minutes, Betsy said yes, realizing that another daunting challenge lay ahead of her. This ordeal lasted for 2 years. If the previous 4 had flown by like a single month, this stretch felt so long that it seemed to have its beginning somewhere in ancient Rome. The only consolation was that the services Betsy provided to the people brought to her by Valeria had resolved all their financial problems. Uncle Jonathan received an endoprosthesis, and although he couldn't handle heavy loads anymore, he didn't shy away from part-time work, taking up jobs as a carpenter, a security guard, or even as a keeper, where he fed animals and cleaned enclosures. Betsy, having learned from the bitter experience of looking after Iris while she was alive, had mastered the art of warding off the occasional energy vampires she encountered. By the time she turned 18, her psyche had strengthened and her gift had blossomed with unprecedented power. She had enough strength to heal almost everyone, even those with very severe conditions. Of course, there were times when she had to refuse the hopeless cases. People who had placed their last hopes on Betsy, though initially upset by her rejection, eventually left in peace, understanding that she was not the Almighty, and her abilities had their limits too. Valeria was more enamored with this new life than anyone else. She managed the finances, took care of the house and the surrounding area, and communicated with those who came from afar and needed a place to stay. By the pond, they now had a dock and 3 boats, and at the base of the hill, closer to the forest, they had built a guest cottage. Betsy not only healed but also found missing persons without a trace. With each passing month, the number of clients grew, and a sense of an impending and inevitable catastrophe began to heavily weigh on Betsy's heart. However, she couldn't halt this momentum anymore. At best, she managed to persuade Valeria that she would take a break by the next spring, citing the need to regain her strength. Reluctantly, Valeria agreed, but Betsy could already see that she wouldn't even make it to October. A new calamity was drawing near with each passing day, hastening its approach. Even the fact that she had managed to straighten out her own documents, thanks to a powerful figure from the criminal circles, whose little son she had saved, did not save her from the dark clouds gathering on the horizon of her fate and the fate of Uncle Jonathan, who remained oblivious to it all. It happened on September 25th at 3:15 in the morning. Unwisely relying on Betsy's abilities, Valeria had neglected to provide adequate security for her home, whether it was a lunatic, an envious person, or someone offended by one of Betsy's rejections. They set fire to her dwelling. Unfortunately, that night, Betsy had fallen into such a deep sleep that she didn't hear or sense anything. Uncle Jonathan was the first to react to the smoke and fire. Valeria, who had taken sleeping pills, couldn't wake up, so it was up to the man to carry both women out of the house, and Betsy, who had lost consciousness from carbon monoxide, was among them. When she came to, firefighters, paramedics, onlookers, and police officers were already swarming around. Nearby, a bewildered puppy was circling. Realizing the full nightmare of what had happened, Betsy once again fell, for the second time in her life, into the state she had experienced once at her grandmother's house. Losing touch with reality, she lay in a hospital bed in a semi-delirious state for a whole 5 days, when she finally regained her senses and pieced together the information about the recent events bit by bit. She learned that Uncle Jonathan had perished in the fire, and Valeria had passed away in the intensive care unit, never waking up. Besides that, Betsy found herself facing 3 criminal charges for illegal entrepreneurial activity, forgery of documents, and involuntary manslaughter. In addition to Uncle Jonathan, they had discovered the body of another person in the house, whom they couldn't identify. This person remained a mystery to Betsy as well. Perhaps it was the arsonist she had encountered in the burning house with Uncle Jonathan, or maybe it was a secret that Valeria took with her to the grave. The court sentenced Betsy to 3 years of imprisonment in a minimum security penitentiary. Betsy was convinced this time she wouldn't emerge from this predicament alive. She had no close companions left by her side. She felt like a curse to everyone who had ever tried to rescue her from misfortune and shield her from sorrow. She loathed herself and her gift, which brought doom to her most beloved and cherished people. Now more than ever, she wished to die so that her name would never be remembered again. While Betsy was in pretrial detention and during her journey to the penitentiary, approaching the same places where she had embarked on her quest for a better life with Uncle Jonathan 5 years ago, no one bothered her much. This solitude allowed her to focus solely on herself. Neither her lawyer, nor endless interrogations, nor court hearings inflicted as much pain as the thoughts of the loved ones she had lost. In isolation, she learned to detach completely from reality, wandering in some ethereal worlds. These could have been parallel dimensions or mere products of her imagination, replacing the dreary reality. In these realms, she could converse with her grandmother Rose, with Uncle Jonathan, and with Valeria. She could see their elusive, shifting forms and could ask questions and receive answers. During the 6 months of the investigation, as they failed to uncover any real evidence against Betsy or direct proof of malicious arson and deliberate financial manipulations on her part, Betsy became so immersed in these fantastical worlds that returning to reality became increasingly difficult with each passing day. However, the reputation of a girl with incredible abilities preceded Betsy. In the penitentiary, where she ultimately found herself, everyone knew the most important thing about her and had plans for her. Now, she had to linger in this reality for longer periods, tearing thread by thread the connections to her salvational worlds. From now on, her gift was the only lifebuoy keeping her afloat in this new existence. To her surprise, Betsy realized that her abilities had expanded and strengthened. Basic searches, connecting with people who had departed to another world, healing ulcers, gastritis, alleviating pain syndromes, and even mending broken bones now required far less effort than before, and she held herself back. She was well aware that she could do much more. 2 years flew by in these constant practices. Betsy never took anything for her sessions and made it clear to everyone that no one owed her anything for her help. However, tea, sugar, and books mysteriously appeared in her locker. The food in the cafeteria was even better than what others received. Even the administration's attitude was lenient, as Betsy occasionally helped them too. So, sometimes she forgot that she was behind barbed wire and not in a private practice in some secluded place. They wanted to relieve her of her work, but that would have been too much, as the sewing shop or the bakery distracted her from her somber thoughts more than anything else. 6 months before her release from the penitentiary, Betsy struck up a rather close friendship with a woman named Vanessa. She was around 40 years old or a bit older, and she was terminally ill. Tuberculosis had left her with no chances. She was supposed to be released in a year, but both Vanessa and Betsy understood that she wouldn't make it even another 6 months. For a long time, Betsy believed that the woman wanted to ask her for the same thing others had wanted from her healing. However, their relationship grew closer and stronger, and Vanessa never mentioned her illness. Something else weighed on her soul, something unrelated to her own fate. Only when she found herself bedridden and constantly coughing did Vanessa finally confide in Betsy about her long withheld story, waiting for the right moment. "You never ask me," she said in a raspy voice due to coughing, "why I ended up here. I know almost everything about you, but you know almost nothing about me. Now I must tell you because it's crucial for you to understand what I'm going to ask of you." Betsy didn't interrupt. She sat by the bedside and remained silent. "Many years ago," the woman continued, "it feels like a completely different life. I wasn't the person you see now. I was ambitious, self-absorbed, thinking only about money. I was willing to do anything for a good life. I could betray, step on others, make deals with the devil himself. What didn't this world tolerate, and what attracted Stephen to me? He's my ex-husband. I never told you this before, but I had a husband and a son. Well, my son Jesse is still around. In fact, it's him I want to talk about when I'm done with the backstory. The backstory is necessary here." Vanessa winced in pain, closed her eyes, shuddered all over, and started coughing again. Betsy took her hand, and after a minute, the coughing fit subsided. "You have another half hour." The duty nurse's voice came from behind the isolation unit door in the sanitation block. Vanessa furrowed her brow and continued, "Stephen is a very good person. It seems like God sent him to me, trying to awaken my dormant soul, but I didn't listen to reason then. My husband had a large company building small yachts and motorboats. The business was expanding. Money was flowing. Stephen was consumed by work. Only when Jesse was born did he start coming home more often, trying to surround both him and me with care and love. For a while, it seemed like I became human again, but then I relapsed. My dark side took over. Jesse was 4 years old then. He was growing up to be a fine boy, smart, obedient, affectionate. He got very attached to me and tears welled up in Vanessa's eyes. I don't deserve forgiveness. That's why I won't ask you to heal me. It won't change anything. In short, I spiraled out of control back then. Besides the exorbitant spending on utterly meaningless things, I got hooked on heroin. Deeply hooked. Stephen tried to shield our son from my influence, and that only infuriated me more. Not because I loved Jesse so much, but because I wanted to be the absolute master of everything. Horrible scandals erupted. Stephen took Jesse out of the house, so he wouldn't witness the war between me and Stephen. My son was too sensitive, very fragile, but back then, I didn't spare anyone. I was consumed by the desire to ruin Stephen's life. I was dying and wanted to drag all my once beloved ones down with me. I made connections with the right people. There were plenty of them in the company, those who wanted to undermine the owner and gain a little more than their status and position allowed, and I succeeded. My knack for turning bad into something better always worked. I managed to redirect some financial flows to offshore accounts that Stephen couldn't control. The company's affairs started deteriorating, but I didn't care about what would happen next. My main goal was just to destroy everything related to my husband. The tax authorities came. The picture of what was happening gradually became clear, and soon all the culprits of this scheme were identified. What broke Stephen wasn't losing a vast amount of money that was fixable. What shattered him was that I seemed to be the mastermind behind it all. He couldn't forgive me for that. So, that's how I ended up behind bars. I hardly remember the first year of my time here. Endless withdrawals, sleepless nights, the agony of brief awakenings of conscience, delusional states. I gradually came to myself, but I was a different person, completely different. I seemed like a stranger to myself. It took me a long time to adjust. Then I started hearing rumors about what was happening in Stephen and Jesse's lives. The most horrifying news was that Jesse fell with some strange ailment. He fell almost immediately after they imprisoned me. His legs became paralyzed. Stephen tried everything doctors, even Tibetan monks, but no one could get Jesse back on his feet. They couldn't even diagnose the condition accurately. There was no spinal cord damage. The causes seemed to have a psychogenic nature. Fluid constantly accumulated in his body, requiring periodic draining. At times, excruciating pain episodes would start, which only morphine could alleviate. Stephen was desperate. Instead of rebuilding his company, he invested all his efforts and resources into helping Jesse. Of course, I don't know all the what's happening now. I wrote many letters, but neither Stephen or Jesse ever replied to any of them. Jesse has been bedridden for 18 years, and no one can do anything to help him. When I first heard about you and your abilities, I was even startled for a while, thinking that if the stories about your powers are true, you might be my only and last chance. This is what I want to ask of you, not for myself but for Jesse. Betsy, please help him. I know you have the power. Wherever I end up after death, I will pray for you. Unfortunately, I have nothing to repay you with. I've lost everything. I understand. Betsy interrupted the woman for the first time. You know, I don't need anything. Even if you had something, I wouldn't take it. Will you help Jesse? Vanessa asked. Of course, Betsy replied confidently. Do you promise? I promise. Just write to Stephen. I'll deliver the letter because it would be hard for me to convince him that I came on your behalf in peace. Yes, I've already written it. Here, take it. Vanessa pulled out a sealed envelope from under her pillow, displaying the precise address. Girls, the nurse's voice was heard again. Wrap it up. It's time. Vanessa tightly grasped Betsy's hand and looked into her eyes with such a plea and pain that it broke Betsy's heart. I'll do everything, Betsy said softly. You can trust me. I'll come back in 3 days. Maybe you'll want to add something to what you've said. Vanessa nodded slightly as if she wanted to say more but remained silent. Tears streamed down her face again. 3 days later, she quietly passed away. In her heart, Betsy had a feeling that Vanessa might not survive those 3 days, but on the day they last saw each other, she simply didn't want to believe it. Another person, who had become close to her, was gone. How much longer would this continue in her life? You couldn't get used to such losses, and there was nothing she could do to fix it. 3 months later, another event occurred that, under different circumstances, might have seemed joyful. Betsy's mother came to visit her in the penitentiary. Betsy had never expected to see her again. However, their conversation didn't amount to much. Laura's mother had come here not out of deep feelings for her daughter, who had disappeared from her life long ago, but because she had probably been paid or, in the worst case, threatened to confirm Betsy's identity. And she did confirm it, although it was evident that she didn't recognize Betsy at all, as she had last seen her when she was very young. They were strangers to each other. Betsy inquired about what had happened to her grandmother's cottage, how many villagers were left in the village, and whether her father, whom she knew was alive, had returned from the city. Laura's mother replied that her grandmother's house had burned down completely. Only 3 old-timers remained in the village, and her father had never shown up. That was essentially the extent of their conversation. As she was leaving, Laura's mother uttered just one sentence. When you get out of here, where do you plan to move? I have a place to stay. Betsy replied briefly and added, goodbye. 3 months later, temporary documents were issued for Betsy, and she was released. It happened precisely on her birthday, May 13th. With the money she had earned over 3 years, Betsy bought a ticket to the city mentioned on the Vanessa's letter. She boarded the train, persuading the conductor to let her into the general compartment, and headed towards the next chapter in her life, hoping that this time things would turn out better than they had before. Stephen was a self-made man. Even in today's world, you can still find people who, once captivated by an idea, dedicate their entire lives to it. It's not so much about the idea itself, but the enduring interest. Ideas are often destructive. They need to constantly adapt to an ever-changing reality. They are harmed by permanence and inflexibility. However, a sustained interest is an entirely different matter. Since childhood, Stephen was fascinated by boats, catamarans, and yachts. He had the opportunity to travel to unique places with many fascinating, sometimes even mysteriously mystical, lakes. Using whatever resources he had at hand, he would construct a catamaran or a boat and test his latest design in the harshest conditions, which offered no forgiveness for carelessness or mistakes. His mother spent her entire life teaching botany and zoology at a school, instilling in her son an appreciation for the plant and animal world. His father spent 30 years at an engineering plant, earning a reputation as a first-class engineer. It was he who taught Stephen how to invent and bring his ideas to life. Until the age of 15, they went on family expeditions, spending weeks on the borders of mountains, taiga, and water, surrounded by misty ridges and unsolved mysteries that had awaited heroes for centuries. This became a real school for Stephen, both as an engineer explorer and simply as a person. After graduating from the Polytechnic Institute, Stephen immediately began to organize his own business. As long as his father was alive, he helped him financially and with necessary connections when it was required to obtain rare equipment or materials. Stephen's business quickly gained momentum. New assembly workshops and docks were built. The number of customers who wanted to buy his boats specifically grew, and then he met Vanessa. Young, slender, strong, vibrant, she charged him with even more energy and ambitions. Vanessa was a professional kayaker, winning prizes at prestigious competitions. They first met during her training on a lake. Stephen built his best boat for her. Vanessa recognized his potential and even then, considering all the prospects, decided to deepen and strengthen her relationship with him. 2 years later, they got married, and Stephen's life took on an entirely different shade. Vanessa gave up her sports career, immersing herself in the glamorous life that Stephen had surrounded her with. Venice, Prague, Paris, the United Arab Emirates' luxurious hotels and restaurants, left to her own devices. As her husband couldn't trade his beloved work for any of those cities, she quickly adapted, managing to spend exorbitant sums and flirt with some handsome men. Yes, what happened later was partly his fault. Being an excellent engineer and a morally upright person, he had no orientation in the realm of human relationships. His emotions remained in the realm of the nearly unexplored. Throughout his youth, with only nature as his companion, he transferred that experience into human relationships. Stephen's view of society continued to be childishly naive. His undeniable engineering talent naturally paved the way for him, so he never had to formulate any special strategies. And the most vulnerable aspect of his character was that he didn't believe in the possibility of betrayal by someone close. Vanessa undoubtedly loved her husband, but love, unlike interest, belongs to the class of ideas that are prone to constant metamorphosis. As they say, there's only a step from love to hatred, and between these extremes, thousands of facets of her other personalities shine. Jesse's birth, for a while, seemed to bring Stephen and Vanessa's relationship back to their beautiful beginnings, but it was an illusion, a feeble attempt by the wife to pass off her desires as reality. The reality now was that not even a desired child could resurrect her permanently altered nature. She quickly grew tired of mundane family responsibilities, of Stephen's perpetual fixation on the same things, and became extremely irritable. She gained weight and severed ties with the last few people who could have kept her from fatal mistakes. Alcohol came first, then a lot of alcohol, followed by drugs. Life spiraled out of control, undermining anyone who dared to try and stop her in any way. It all culminated in a distant correctional facility, with a belated repentance and a fateful encounter with Betsy. On the evening of May 17th, Stephen sat in his office on the second floor, hunched over drawings. The office still retained remnants of its former coziness. Almost nothing had changed here since he and Vanessa had built this two-story house, surrounded by various infrastructure, utility buildings, a little lakeside cottage, and guest caravans adorned with clusters of colorful nasturtiums. The nasturtiums had long ceased to bloom, and most of the buildings were now lonely in the shadow of overhanging pine trees. The lights in almost all the windows remained off, and the harmonious chorus of human voices no longer echoed through the area. Stephen mechanically continued to invent, draw, sketch, refine, sometimes even taking up tools and disappearing into the dock for days, but there was no longer any particular purpose behind all this. He just had to get through another day, ensuring that Jesse had everything he needed in his room on the ground floor, food, another round of useless medicines, bugs, a 2-hour ride in Jonathan's wheelchair, and a consultation from a professor who had responded to their call, making the arduous journey to their remote location like many before him, only to shrug in bewilderment. Unable to fathom the cause and nature of Jesse's affliction, neither Stephen nor Jesse had any hope of a favorable outcome. His son had mostly stopped talking, reluctantly answering his father's questions. His legs had given out since he learned that his mother had been imprisoned. God only knew what his child's mind had painted when his father's sister delivered that unfortunate news. It began with disappearing vision, followed by jaw pain and facial muscle aches, then numbness in his right foot. In one fine morning, he simultaneously lost his ability to walk and see. They managed to restore his vision. Doctors dealt with the trigeminal neuralgia, but his legs remained unresponsive to any therapy. It was as if an invisible hand had pressed a secret button, disabling his ability to walk. For 18 years, Jesse lay there, unable to move a single finger on his legs. Hundreds of consultations, dozens of trips to the finest clinics in America and Europe, visits to shamans, sorcerers, and monks in Tibetan monasteries. None of these brought any results. Only the words of one woman stuck in Stephen's memory. "There is only one person in the whole wide world," she had said, "who can get your son back on his feet." "Where can I find this person?" Stephen had eagerly asked. "He will find Jesse himself," she replied, "if he hears words of repentance." It sounded too cryptic and uncertain. Soon enough, Stephen dismissed what he had heard as a collection of nonsensical phrases, behind which the woman had hidden her own helplessness, but they did stick in his memory. What person, what repentance, and whose? Occasionally, that episode resurfaced in his mind, but quickly dissipated as no answers came to mind. Over time, Stephen had to close all the workshops, lay off workers, and sell off most of his assets. He had to let go of much of the staff that once managed his extensive estate. Only he, Jesse, and the security guard, Mark, who agreed for a penance to not only oversee the territory but also perform other roles as needed, from janitor to gardener to caregiver, remained as permanent residents. Stephen often had to travel for business to nearby European cities. Finances continued to dwindle relentlessly. The frozen offshore accounts, where Vanessa had managed to transfer substantial sums, were seized. Foreign bureaucracy proved so cumbersome that he had to constantly shuttle between authorities and courts, trying to expedite the process of unfreezing and recovering his hard-earned funds. Tomorrow was yet another such trip, and he was almost devoid of strength. Stephen had become so despondent that he moved mechanically, hoping that eventually everything would somehow resolve itself with the passing of Jesse, his own death, or a miraculous turn of events that would offer a glimmer of hope. On the evening of May 17th, Stephen's despair reached an unprecedented level. Everything around him seemed like a horrifying nightmare where the most fundamental physical laws didn't apply. His legs refused to obey. Bullets fell before exiting the barrel of a gun. Vocal cords wouldn't close to produce sound. How was it possible that in the modern world, teeming with breakthroughs in every sphere of life, such hopelessness in the face of Jesse's ailment existed? He would sooner believe that the world was pretending to be powerless, ignoring Stephen's existence, punishing him for the mistakes of his youth, and showing him that he meant nothing to this world, despite all his intentions and talents. For a moment, Stephen feared he wouldn't see tomorrow morning. Was this the end? The certainty of that thought was terrifying. Goosebumps ran down his spine. He stood up from his desk and tightly closed the window. At that very moment, a concerned voice came from the intercom. "Stephen, I apologize, but there's a young lady here who wants to speak with you. She says it's very important and concerns Jesse." "What?" Stephen involuntarily blurted out. "What young lady? Where is she from? Did she introduce herself?" "Her name is Betsy," Mark clarified. "She claims to have an accompanying letter. She says you'll understand everything from its contents. Let her in and escort her to my office." Stephen replied. For the first time in many years, something pleasant stirred in Stephen's soul. He couldn't understand the sudden spark of hope. Once again, the face of his grandmother, whom he used to take little Jesse to visit, flashed in his mind, and he recalled her strange words about a person who would find Jesse on his own. Perhaps this was the person he had been thinking about a moment ago. A foolish thought, a silly hope, but it had already ignited in the depths of his weary heart. In his current situation, he could grasp onto anything. About 10 minutes later, there was a soft knock on the door. "Come in," Stephen confidently said. The door cracked open, and behind the tall figure of Mark, another figure appeared. A petite, short woman entered the office, smiling shyly. "I'll wait outside, just in case," Mark said, leaving the guest alone with the owner. "Hello," the young woman said softly, taking an envelope from a plastic bag and handing it to the man. She added, "This is from Vanessa. If you read it, you'll understand everything yourself." From Vanessa, Stephen became anxious. "How do you know her? What does she want from me?" "My name is Betsy. Vanessa doesn't need anything anymore." "She? Well, she's no longer with us." Stephen felt a chilling shiver run down his spine. He hadn't expected to hear her name this evening. He was lost in speculation. Despite the tragedy of everything that had happened 18 years ago, his love for this woman had never completely faded from his heart. Somehow, regardless of everything, Vanessa had been the reason Jesse ended up bedridden. Stephen could forgive betrayal, theft, and much more, but not what she had done to their son. His human heart couldn't forgive that. Let God decide. With trembling hands, Stephen tore open the envelope, took out the folded sheet of paper, sat down by the lamp, and began to read. With each line he read, his face grew paler. After finishing, he remained silent for another 3 minutes, as if forgetting Betsy's presence in his office. Then he snapped out of it, looked at her with an alarmed expression, and said, "You understand that if this turns out to be some kind of malicious game, you won't leave this house alive." He himself was startled by his words, as if some demon had temporarily taken control of his mind and spoken in his place. At the same time, Stephen realized it was true. He would act that way if the girl had come to the house with malicious intentions. Could Vanessa have known about the words of the forest seer? No, she couldn't have. Stephen hadn't mentioned a word to anyone about that memorable conversation. Vanessa's words in the letter were convincing. This Betsy could very well be the person from the prophecy of the forest seer. Doubts knotted him, but the hope that it ignited was growing brighter with each passing minute. "I understand," Betsy said, trying to maintain her composure. "I know how it looks, but I've come in peace. I've come to fulfill Vanessa's last wish, and if you allow me, I will try to help your son." "I need to think about it," Stephen said, already realizing that tomorrow morning he would agree to anything. "Mark will show you where to stay, at least for tonight. Are you hungry?" he asked when Mark appeared at the door, having been eavesdropping on the conversation earlier. "Don't worry, I'm not hungry," she replied. "All right," Stephen concluded. "Mark, please find her accommodations." "Okay," the security guard said. After a minute, his heavy footsteps faded away, leaving Stephen even more bewildered. Betsy's appearance had illuminated his past, present, and future in a flash of lightning. Now all that was left was to wait for dawn. The night was clearly going to be sleepless, and tomorrow, at noon, he had a week-long trip that couldn't be canceled. Betsy also couldn't sleep that night, not so much because she was anxious about Stephen's decision tomorrow, but because of the darkness closing in from all corners. She wasn't prepared for such an overwhelming darkness. It was as if a curse had woven a cocoon around the entire house, and over the 18 years, that first strand of web that had once stuck to Jesse's feet had long been lost in the dense tangle of causes and effects. For the first time in her life, Betsy was scared to the point where she lost her confidence in the successful outcome of the impending battle with evil. But the more this fear tried to take hold of her heart, the clearer it became to her that this trial would be the last and most important in her life. She accepted the challenge because she felt that it was now thrown not to Jesse, not to Stephen, not to the late Vanessa, but solely to her, as if fate had saved this moment for the decisive strike. It had been pulling, waiting for the right moment, and that moment had arrived. In the morning, Mark knocked on the door and asked Betsy to be ready to meet Stephen in half an hour. She was prepared for anything, even if it required putting her life on the line. What had seemed foreign and distant had now become personal. This was her war, a war to free herself from the burden of her gift. Stephen was concise. He preferred to avoid inmate tones in the conversation. He explained in detail the history of Jesse's illness and outlined the rules that Betsy should follow when interacting with his son. He warned that Mark would be monitoring the situation, and cameras had been installed in Jesse's room. If anything went wrong or even seemed suspicious to Mark, he would intervene, and the guests would have to leave the house forever. "I'm leaving myself," Stephen added. "In 3 hours, I have to go. I'll be gone for a week. I'll try to return earlier, but I can't promise. If there's anything else you need for your work, please tell me now, and I'll make all the necessary arrangements." "No," Betsy replied. "I don't need anything." "Then let's go." Stephen gestured towards one of the rooms along the long corridor they were currently walking down. "I'll introduce you to my son." Jesse lay on a bed that looked more like a chair from a spaceship. In his hands, he held a book and didn't immediately tear his gaze away from it when his father and Betsy entered the room. "Jesse," Stephen said, approaching his son's bedside. "Good morning. Please take a moment." The young man, very thin with short cropped hair but a face that remained handsome despite the disease distorting his features, raised his eyes and nodded silently. "Son," Stephen continued, "this is Betsy. She's come to help you." For a brief moment, deep wrinkles frowned Jesse's forehead, but when he looked at Betsy, initially with a vague and indifferent expression, his discontent quickly disappeared from his face. It felt as if he had met a long-lost friend, someone he hadn't seen in ages, and he was genuinely happy to see them again. Joy, surprise, concern, and worry all mingled in Jesse's gaze, and Betsy quickly picked up on this unexpected reaction from the young man. And the darkness, which had been closing in around Betsy, seemed to shudder and halt as if it had encountered an obstacle. Her heart began to beat faster. It felt like all of this had happened in her life once before. The same person lying motionless in bed, a sunny day in early or late summer, the feeling of exhaustion from a long journey, and no, this day of you had a solid basis. Now Betsy remembered that moment when she had met Jesse before. Oh my God, this was incredible. On that day when she and Graham Morris had first visited the forest cabin, there, in the cramped room filled with the scent of healing herbs, lay a little boy, slightly older than Betsy, along with his father, and there was this very Stephen, only much younger and without a beard. Betsy remembered how Jesse had looked at her back then, with timid hope, a silent plea, and a call for help. There was so much pain in his gaze, and she had felt so sorry for him that she had cried the whole evening when the guests left Graham Morris's place. So, this was when the knot was tied, the one that would take so long to unravel throughout Betsy's life. "Hello," Jesse said quietly, addressing Betsy. "I recognize you. Do you remember me?" Stephen was astonished, his eyes darting between Betsy and Jesse. He was puzzled, apparently trying to remember something but failing to do so. "Jess," Betsy replied, "I remember you." "Hello." Wait. Stephen shook his head. "Do you two know each other? What's going on, Jesse?" The young man smiled faintly, placed the book on the nightstand, pressed a button on a remote control, and the top of the bed adjusted to a more vertical position. Jesse then began to recount to his father what he could remember from their long-ago trip. He even remembered the name of the village. Stephen's memories seemed to have completely faded over time, but he was pleased that Jesse had become so animated and enthusiastic about something for the first time in years. The unexpected turn of events somewhat reassured Betsy. Now, Stephen was leaving with a lighter heart. If such a strong connection had been established between Jesse and the girl right away, it was already a good sign. Sitting down beside Jesse, Betsy tried to get her initial impressions of his condition. Both his spine and nervous system appeared to be in good order, confirming the assessments of the previous doctors. The problem was deeply rooted in Jesse's soul. Unconsciously, he had given himself a directive not to walk in childhood, and that directive continued to hinder his recovery. Over the years, this directive had become encrusted with layers of disappointment, turning into a petrified blockage. Now, moving this boulder from its place, let alone completely removing it, seemed almost impossible. Even in these first few minutes, Betsy realized that the battle ahead of her would be heavier than any she had ever fought before. Her heart raced. Would she have enough strength? Even Graham Morrow's had not had enough, but this time, she couldn't back down. She couldn't abandon Jesse this time. After all, everything had been orchestrated by someone above for the sake of this moment, for their distant meeting in the future. This time, it was all or nothing. And the darkness quivered for a moment. Betsy sensed this movement. Powerful streams of energy began to fill her entire being. She saw flashes of light breaking through the dense darkness. She heard familiar voices. All those who had left her on the other side of existence rushed to her aid. Betsy could feel their confident presence. The pounding of warm hearts reached her. Together, they would surely defeat the evil. They would show it. I must go. Stephen's voice interrupted the flood of visions that had rushed over Betsy. Betsy visited Jesse twice a day, early in the morning and late in the evening. The actual session lasted for about an hour, and afterward, they would simply talk. Betsy shared stories about her life with Jesse, and he, in turn, spoke about his. From what she heard, Betsy concluded that the roots of Jesse's illness could be traced back to his feelings about his mother being imprisoned. In the child's mind, the image of a prison resembled a very cramped cage, like the ones they use for selling chickens at the market. This distorted image completely misrepresented his beloved mother. The boy was more attached to her than to his father, and loved her despite her flaws. What frightened Jesse the most lately was the prospect of being taken to this imaginary prison to visit his mother. Perhaps that's what his sister Vanessa had hoped to achieve by instilling fear in the young Jesse. She might have sensed that she could make him detest Vanessa by making him associate her with this terrifying place, but instead of disgust, this fear embedded itself like a splinter in Jesse's heart. He didn't want to see his beloved person in such a distorted, nightmarish form. He wanted to remember his mother differently, as tender, kind, beautiful, and strong. However, he would be taken there without regard for his wishes, and he would be forced to witness it. It was at that moment that the spontaneous desire to lose the ability to walk might have emerged. After all, if his legs refused to carry him, no one could take him to that prison. Nevertheless, understanding the situation and actually removing the splinter from Jesse's heart were two entirely different tasks. Optimism emerged when, during the second session, Jesse managed to move his fingers on his right leg. But then, progress seemed to stall once more. The following 3 days showed no improvement in his healing, and even the hard-won progress began slipping away. However, the worst occurred on the 6th day. Early in the morning, Jesse fell back into his usual silent despair. Betsy no longer knew how to encourage him or set a positive tone. It seemed like he was convinced that this attempt had also failed. His fingers stopped responding to his will, and everything returned to its previous state. Moreover, his vision deteriorated significantly, to the point where he couldn't tread without glasses. The darkness had unleashed all its remaining reserves, but only Betsy understood that these reserves were all the darkness had left. Victory was so close, and her gift was stronger than ever before. It required an equally bold step from her side to engage in this final battle with everything laid bare, to give herself entirely down to the last drop. On the evening of the seventh day, Betsy was prepared for the decisive battle. Internally, she closed all doors behind her, leaving no way to retreat. Jesse felt that Betsy was not her usual self today. He sensed the energy emanating from her, every fiber of her exhausted body. There were no conversations between them this evening, no words of encouragement. Instead, it was as if an electric charge surged through the entire room when Betsy touched Jesse. This discharge seemed to stun him and blind him. Images from the past flashed before his eyes, taking him back to his youth, his childhood, and even further, until he crossed the threshold of his own birth. His life seemed to be rebooting. Myriads of bright, trembling points filled the infinite blue space, where Jesse, devoid of his physical form, seemed to hang in stillness, not understanding where was down, where was up, or where there was any direction at all. He realized that now he had to act on his own. Which way should he move? He began to search for guidance, and soon it appeared. A bright point, as if from all sides simultaneously, started approaching him, growing in size and radiating pleasant warmth. The warmth enveloped him, and he began to regain substance. Jesse couldn't see himself, but he could feel that he had a body again. Jesse merged with this omnipresent light, fused with this warmth. Now he was both the light and the warmth. Then, images began to manifest in the space. At first, they were vague, but with each passing second, they became clearer and more understandable. He started to see the ordinary world again. His childhood home, when it was still full of people. His mother, kissing him on the forehead. His father, allowing him to polish the hull of a catamaran for the first time. His childhood, the eyes of an unfamiliar girl in the forest. A shaman in a bear's skin, loudly uttering incomprehensible phrases to the beat of a drum. Then back to his childhood home, the familiar room with a spacious cosmic bed, a stack of unread books waiting their turn. He opened his eyes and didn't immediately understand where he was now. Was he returning from where he had just been, or was he here, in bed, in the arms of the unresponsive Betsy? For Mark, who was monitoring Jesse's room on the monitor, everything appeared much more mundane. Over the past 7 days, he had become accustomed to Betsy's repetitive sessions. He maintained a rather skeptical attitude toward all this shamanism. He didn't expect anything unusual this time either, so he didn't immediately notice that something was following a very strange script. Initially, Betsy was sitting next to Jesse, occasionally making hand movements. Mark got distracted for just a minute, went to pour himself a fresh cup of tea, and when he returned, he couldn't believe his eyes. Betsy had removed all her clothes and climbed into bed with Jesse, who seemed to be asleep because he wasn't reacting to this at all. She pressed herself against him, remaining completely still. Mark couldn't figure out what he should do. Was this part of today's session, or was something completely inappropriate happening before his eyes, requiring his intervention? He didn't know. While his thoughts, like a poorly lubricated mechanism, struggled in his head, the image on the monitor became even more incredible. Jesse woke up, freed himself from Betsy's embrace, and stood on the bed, shaking her. The girl didn't respond in any way. Jesse began to look around in fear, searching with his eyes for the cameras, and when he spotted one of them, he waved his arms, clearly signaling to Mark. Mark also snapped out of it, jumped off his chair, and rushed to the house. He entered the house and, opening the door to Jesse's room, saw that he was standing on his own 2 feet beside the bed, still trying to shake Betsy. "Call an ambulance." Jesse turned to Mark, shouting, "Mark, the ambulance." Mark, completely bewildered, rushed back to his booth, oblivious to everything around him. Only when he reached the gate did he notice the headlights of Stephen's car. It seemed that Stephen had just returned and was waiting for someone to open the gate. Then everything changed. Everything became different. For those who were participants or witnesses to what happened, it was a miracle that would have been impossible to believe under different circumstances. But it happened. It appeared as a chain of random events and coincidences. But what truly transpired in the souls of these people, Betsy, Jesse, and Stephen, could only be imagined, depicted as magical images. None of them, even if asked, would share their secret, partly because they didn't fully understand it themselves, and partly because they were afraid of scaring away the newfound beauty with which they now lived. With great difficulty, on the evening when Jesse stood up, the medics managed to timely transport the nearly lifeless Betsy to the hospital. Stephen ensured that she received the best treatment and care. Having given all his strength to Jesse, the girl had already lost hope of survival. However, after lying in a coma for almost a month, she gradually regained consciousness. Much to the surprise of the doctors, she recovered fairly quickly and had not separated from Jesse since then. The price of this might have seemed high to someone. By saving her life, the girl had forever lost her gift. But for Betsy, it was happiness. From her former abilities, only one feeling remained, one that would never fade. She knew that now her life and Jesse's were intertwined by some unifying thread. Each of them, individually, probably couldn't survive, neither physically nor morally. Stephen's final trip to Europe was also successful. All the accounts were finally unfrozen. He managed to settle with the creditors, gradually restored the abandoned workshops, and old clients once again lined up for his services. Jesse completed university, earned an engineering degree, and happily joined his father's work. 2 years after that memorable night, Betsy and Jesse had a modest wedding, and half a year later, they set out together to fulfill one of Betsy's long-held dreams to restore her grandmother Rose's cottage in the village. Now, it was their secret place where they visited every summer. The village itself began to come alive too. Many people wanted to buy land there for their country homes. Although it no longer resembled a typical village, life was beginning to flourish there. Laura sold her house. When Betsy and Jesse first visited, they found it empty. Her trail had vanished. And that, dear listeners, is the story of how a simple day in the woods turned into a life-altering encounter. If you enjoyed this tale and want to hear more captivating stories, be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced something that changed your life in an instant? Until next time, stay curious and keep the fire of story